Hello, nerds for Yang.
Hello, nerds!
Hello, nerds!
Hello, nerds!
Hello, nerds!
Hello, nerds!
Hello, nerds!
I'm saying, now with this campaign, bang, dang, it's and Drew, come roll with the Yang Gang.
Hello, nerds!
And hello back to you, nerds, all of you.
Welcome, Stephen Shafarman, to the show, author of a book about basic income. I'm so thrilled to have you join us.
I'm delighted to be here. I've been talking about basic income for many years with many people, and this is an added privilege.
Well, so it sounds like you're one of those guys you're into basic income before it became cool.
Long before. I published a first book about it in 1998 and had been on the issue for many years already at that point.
Love it, love it. Well, before we get into that, why don't you just share a little bit about your background and yourself so people can get to know who Steve Shafarman is?
Happily. My background actually is in philosophy and psychology, and I came to the idea of basic income by thinking about how young children learn to walk and talk and make sense of the world, and applying the cliche analogy of the body politic, and wondering if we collectively can outgrow pollution, racism, crime, war, and so on. And just seemed obvious at some point that young children learn when their basic needs are provided by their parents. So maybe the answer is to guarantee that everyone can meet their basic needs with a universal cash payment.
And what were you doing, Steve, from a career point of view before or as you were interested in this topic? What was your day job?
Then and now I teach a fitness healing exercise practice, mainly called the Feldenkrais method, and also in a more dynamic version, Flex Aware. And it's specifically based on the way young children learn and move, and helps people of all ages breathe freely, move easily, outgrow back pain and other difficulties.
Right.
And so that led directly to the analogy of the body politic and thinking about society.
And could you remember, Steve, when you first encountered the idea of basic income, and what was that kind of initial introduction to the concept like for you personally?
I studied with Dr. Moshe Feldenkrais in the early 1980s and traveled with him as his assistant for a time. And then in 1984, I moved to Santa Barbara. And Santa Barbara, among other claims to fame, was the home of a group called the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions. And those who are serious about the history of basic income. And I present a comprehensive history in the appendix of my book, Our Future. In 1963, there was a scholarly report called the Triple Revolution that began to look at cybernetics and warfare and peace and human needs, and concluded that we had to provide people with some type of guaranteed income. And many of the authors were quite renowned in social sciences, a couple of Nobel laureates. And when I moved to Santa Barbara, I met several people who had been on the staff of the center there, and they talked about it, and I had already been playing with similar ideas, and the rest kind of just unfolded.
What was the early reception to the idea from sort of mainstream folks back when you first encountered it? And how does that compare to the reception that basic income is getting today?
Oh, that's a great history. Through the 80s and 90s and beyond, when I would talk to people about anything like a universal income or guaranteed income, immediately there would be all sorts of knee-jerk objections. Oh, that's impossible. We can't possibly do that. We can't afford it. I've never heard of such a thing. Don't be so utopian and idealistic. I self-published a book on it in 1998 while I was in graduate school, and then moved to Washington, D.C. because I was so committed to these ideas. Then got involved with the U.S. Basic Income Network, which was founded in 2000, and first visited the meeting of the Basic Income Earth Network in 2002. That was their conference in Geneva. But even into the 2000s, there were just knee-jerk objections, especially in Washington. See, Washington's a fascinating place. And a lot of the people that I was meeting in my efforts to network on this idea were old political activists and had worked in Congress, and mainly liberal Democrats, but not entirely. And often people would say some variation of, oh, we love that idea, but, and then would start talking about how they can't support guaranteed income because they're too busy playing defense to protect Social Security, or to prevent cuts in the minimum wage, or to preserve some other specific program. And many people into the 2000s from the liberal Democratic side would immediately caution that, well, George McGovern talked about a guaranteed income and he lost, so we can never talk about that again, which is obviously absurd. McGovern lost for countless reasons. But I would hear that from serious people. So the discourse began to shift significantly around 2013. And perhaps you recall, and you can easily find online, in October of 2013, the activists in Switzerland had collected enough signatures for a national referendum on a guaranteed income.
Yeah.
And they did this brilliant stunt where they got, I think it was 6 million 5-cent coins, and dumped them in the town square in Zurich and kept them there overnight so people could come and picnic or even sleep out on the coins. And that story was picked up in mass media around the world. It ran in the New York Times, National Public Radio, the Washington Post, and many other outlets, with the great photographs of the coins. And many of those stories here in the US mentioned the fact that guaranteed income was a mainstream moderate idea in the 1960s. Many of those stories referred to Milton Friedman, the Nobel laureate economist, and Richard Nixon, whose family assistance plan was a version of a guaranteed income and passed in the House with 2/3 of the vote, but was blocked in the Senate. And several of those stories concluded with some version of, well, maybe this idea could come back here in the US. And with all that media attention, I began to find that when I would meet people and talk to them, suddenly the idea had a resonance, and they would say, yeah, that's something we ought to think about. And then, of course, we got to 2017 and 2018, and Andrew Yang published his book and then launched his campaign, and history is moving forward at an accelerating pace.
What was your reaction when you first came across Yang running for president? Did you think he would get as far as he had gotten, or were you expecting him to go further? Like, what was your reaction as a basic income supporter for so many years?
I first heard about his plan for a campaign with the announcement of his book. I think that was in March of 2017 when his book first came out. or 2018 when his book first came out.
Mm-hmm.
And so when the first time I heard that he was going to be in the DC area, I made a point of going to his rally and meeting him. And I certainly didn't know how far it would get, but was eager to support him and work with him and help to spread the word.
Did you?
So
when you heard him talk about basic income, I'm guessing there's probably like different emphases and flavors and approaches. What was what's your evaluation of the Yang proposal versus what you were hoping we would do?
I love the clarity and simplicity of his proposal, and just saying $1,000 a month makes it very easy to grasp. And the emphasis on it being universal and calling it the freedom dividend. So all of that was great. The points that I mainly emphasize are the role in reinvigorating our politics and renewing our democracy. And it was fun during his campaign to watch the evolution of his language and his presentation. And when he began to talk more about ranked choice voting and getting money out of politics and empowering people as citizens. So I've been working on all of those issues, and for me, all of these issues are really interrelated.
So would it be fair?
It's not just about jobs.
Would it be fair to say you were part of the Yang Gang, or were you was he one of your choices, but maybe not your top choice?
You can definitely say I was part of the Yang Gang, though living in Washington, D.C., knowing a lot of people who are very involved in politics, knowing some members of Congress, I had no expectation for how far he would get. I've looked at the history of the Democratic Party and politics generally, and really expected the Democratic Wall Street establishment to find ways to swat him down. So my best hope, and it's still my hope, is that this idea of a freedom dividend, a universal basic income, will get into the Democratic platform in some way. And maybe Joe Biden will speak favorably about a smaller version of it. And obviously, we have a whole bunch of people around the country who are running for Congress and other offices talking about it. And I'm happy consulting with several already and eager to consult with more and to use my book to help them be more effective communicators. So if we can elect even a handful, even one or two people who really emphasize UBI, I think that will help shift the Democratic Party.
What advice do you give people, Steve, when they're running for Congress and they want to advocate for UBI? How do you suggest they communicate it to potential voters and kind of explain the story of it? I mean, I think a lot of people find that when they are trying to get friends and family interested, it just requires it's like a long dinner conversation. It's not a coffee conversation.
Well, I think it can be a coffee conversation or even an elevator pitch conversation. And what I find to be most effective, and this approach that I take in our future, is to make these ideas personal. And by making it very direct and personal, I find that we can cut through all the political labels and the knee-jerk responses. So I always start with asking people, well, what do you want in your life? And what do you think our political system should provide? And often, do you agree that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are unalienable rights? Because in a society that operates through markets and with money, everyone needs some income in order to secure our life and our liberty, in order to actively pursue happiness. So by that logic, a basic income ought to be an unalienable right. And in fact, that's what Thomas Paine said in 1797, that it's a right and not a charity.
So some people have debated whether this idea is so deeply American, to your point about Thomas Paine and, Milton Friedman and Republicans and Democrats alike, finding support for this idea, at least within those parties. There's certainly a growing constituency. So some people think like, hey, this is a purely American thing. It's actually a perfect fit for this country. And other people say, oh, this needs to be experimented in a place like Switzerland or Sweden or something. And then in time, the US will catch up, kind of like climate change. It takes us a little while, but we'll get there. What's your thoughts on, is America ready for this?
I think America is more than ready for this, and I would like to see America lead rather than merely follow. On the question of experiments in Sweden or Switzerland or anywhere else, or experiments in towns or cities around the US, my answer is, well, there were no experiments or pilot projects for Social Security or Medicare or the Trump tax cut or any of the other big programs that we've seen recently or in US history. And so let's start with some version of a basic income. Maybe it's $500 a month, or even less, but something that asserts that everyone as a right will have that income and will have the means to make better choices for themselves and their families. So I'm looking to have something happen as soon as possible. I'd like to see a debate about it in the next Congress starting in January and February.
What is your interpretation of the debate in the primaries? A lot of the Bernie supporters, most notably AOC, had suggested that, well, this is a Republican Trojan horse to gut the social safety net, and it don't fall for these dirty tricks. What's your take on that?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned AOC. I'll digress a bit. If anyone has seen the Netflix documentary, Take Down the House, about AOC and Brand New Congress, some of that was filmed at an event at American University that was hosted by Brand New Congress. And living in DC, and being an activist, I knew about that event and was invited. And so I talked to AOC and other Brand New Congress candidates about basic income that day. And during her campaign in 2018, she often mentioned basic income in her stump speech. And anyone who goes back and listens to her stump speeches during that year can find her mentioning it. She didn't go into any detail, but it was there. As soon as she took office, however, she began listening to more established Democrats and to people like Bernie. And Bernie has not supported basic income. Bernie believes in a guaranteed jobs guarantee. And so during the first year in office, I never heard her talk about basic income, but recently she's talking about it again. Now, to get back to your specific question, is this the Trojan horse for trying to cut Social Security and TANF and food stamps and such? Yeah, that's a real fear that I hear from a lot of strong progressives, but I don't think it's well-founded. And specifically, I often hear it phrased in terms of Andrew Yang and the Silicon Valley tech bros. And people say, oh, we can't endorse that because Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk and the Silicon Valley gang will use it as an excuse to cut all the existing programs. To which my usual response is to just laugh and say, you're not going to let that happen, right? And you and your progressive friends and allies are going to insist that we only cut programs when they truly become superfluous. And we're going to use the basic income to engage and empower all citizens in demanding that programs be strengthened where necessary and not cut. My experience is that those sorts of objections fade away when we speak to people directly and personally, and speak to people in terms of their immediate needs, concerns, and interests.
If you flip that argument around, as a former Republican and still someone with some libertarian streak to me, part of me feels like, well, if the same or greater economic value is being provided to the people, why should we care if it's through a cash payment or through a large federal program? In fact, like, wouldn't it be more efficient to
Yes.
give the same amount? Like, I'm not saying I don't want to pay taxes. I'm fine paying the taxes. I just want it going directly to the citizens and not through this, sometimes inefficient federal bureaucracy. Do you think the progressives, like the folks really kind of on the far left, would ever be okay with that? Because part of me feels like, well, look, we all want the same thing. We want citizens to have the most value created and generated and delivered. So why shouldn't we just be agnostic about the, what pipes it goes through before it gets to the people?
Well, when I was writing Our Future, for several years, I actually was working on two parallel versions of the book. So in one, I was crafting my arguments for progressives and liberals, and in the other, I was crafting my arguments for conservatives and libertarians. Mm-hmm. And the final book, Our Future, the Basic Income Plan, is the synthesis of those two, looking to speak to everyone. And there are a lot of conservatives and libertarians who endorse basic income, starting with the Nobel laureates Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek, who were great heroes even of contemporary libertarians. There's a professor of economics in North Carolina who ran for Congress as, I think it was Congress, might have been state office, as a libertarian named Mike Munger. And he endorses it specifically as a way to cut and simplify government. So I think we can appeal to people from across the political spectrum, and we can even appeal to the folks who voted for Trump and who are wearing their MAGA hats and say, if you really want to make America great, then basic income is a way to do that.
And what's your take, Stephen, on what party, if this is an idea that can actually take root in either parties? There are some people who believe that, well, both parties are so entrenched in some established dogma that because this idea has support from parts of both parties, that it really maybe needs to come out of a third party movement. Do you have any thoughts on how to get this thing done, or do you think the Democratic Party is the best place to incubate it?
I am agnostic and eclectic, and I want to incubate it from all the parties and all the groups. So in the last chapter of Our Future, I talk about political strategies and suggest that, well, it could be the Democrats who are the champions. And of course, thanks to Andrew Yang, the Democrats are leading the charge right now. But if they fail to implement it, maybe in the next election, 2022 and 2024, it will be Republicans who take these ideas and become the champions as a way to rebuild their party and reinvigorate their core ideals. And similarly, it could come from the Green Party. And I've talked to many people in the Green Party who've endorsed versions of basic income. In fact, in the appendix of Our Future, I quote from the Green Party platform, and since 2004, the National Green Party platform has included a plank calling for a guaranteed basic income.
Yeah, it's interesting in that if I didn't know, I actually would have assumed that this idea would have been promoted more actively by, let's call them progressive Republicans. And it would, I kind of agree with you. I would not be surprised, like if the Democratic Party doesn't want to take this and run with it, then it could be one of the key ways that the GOP reinvents itself as it recovers from, you know, kind of the MAGA, you know, hangover.
Yeah, and I like the fact that we're talking about that today, because the more we talk about that, the more we put pressure on the Dems to act on this idea instead of leaving it on the shelf and letting the GOP use it to rebuild after Trump. So,
yeah, Stephen, let's talk a little bit about the book. So tell me about, like, I'm going to share just my screen so some people can just take a look at the table of contents there, which is available on Amazon and probably other places where you buy books. But tell me a little bit about writing this book, researching it. It sounds like it has been developing in your head for decades. But you know, I would love to hear a little of the origin story for the book itself.
Yes, it's been developing for decades. As I mentioned, I published a book in 1998 while I was in graduate school. And because I was in graduate school, that one was intentionally fairly academic. One of my faculty advisors actually had worked as a speechwriter in the White House under Jimmy Carter. And he was very helpful in formulating my ideas and getting me to make it very clear and simple. But again, I was in graduate school. I wanted to impress him and the other faculty members. So soon after that was published, I began realizing that in order to generate widespread support, in order to make these ideas happen, it was going to require a much clearer and simpler presentation. So I then moved to Washington, D.C. and wrote another version of the book that was much more straightforward. And then a third version that came out in the summer of 2001 that was very short and simple, with the title, We the People. But just a few weeks after that book came out, September 11th happened. And it seemed very clear to me that the political discourse for new ideas was going to shut down for at least a few years and perhaps a decade. And so I mostly began to focus again on my FlexAware and Feldenkrais teaching and the things that I do for my own income and to make sure that I have food and shelter. But as we approached the 2008 election, I began to obsess over these ideas once again and worked on another book. But again, as soon as it was published, I realized that it didn't quite do what was necessary. And it was in 2011 that I had the idea of two parallel books, making the concept of a basic income very direct and personal. So one had the subtitle talking about peace and justice and economic security for all. And the second had a subtitle talking about cutting taxes and shrinking government and promoting free enterprise, or promoting private enterprise. And you can guess which one was targeting which audience. But it was the same argument in both cases. Is if we start with some type of universal basic income, we have a way to empower individual citizens directly as citizens so that we can begin to have discussions about all of these issues. And after a few years of working on the parallel books, I found a way to merge them, and that's what led to this final book, Our Future, the Basic Income Plan for Peace, Justice, Liberty, Democracy, and Personal Dignity. And I was delighted to get a nice quote from Andrew for the cover.
See. Yeah.
And so on the front cover, it's slightly abridged, and the full quote that he gave me is on the back cover. And on the website, ourfutureubi.com. I was particularly pleased, actually, because when he sent me the quote, he just used my first name, Steve, whereas several of the other people who send me quotes, who I know much better and longer, used my full name. So it gave the added illusion of familiarity or even intimacy.
Yeah. Do you think, did you guys discuss any of the topics as you were writing it, or when he was sort of reviewing it? Did you and Andrew get to chat a little?
No, we didn't have any ongoing conversations like that, though. Just to backtrack slightly, in 2017, as I was just finishing work on this book, I did a very limited publication of an early version with the title Basic Income Imperative. And at one of my first meetings with Andrew, I gave him a copy of that. And so I know he had that copy in his campaign headquarters because I saw it on the shelf when I visited him there in New York. And I believe some of those ideas actively got into his discourse and into the campaign. But he and I never had any lengthy conversations about this book or how it was unfolding.
If you were in a room with Andrew now and he was saying, hey, Steve, I'm starting to think about 2024, and obviously basic income is going to be a big part of it, what advice would you give me about how to better communicate the idea than I did in 2020? What critique can you offer?
Well, in a sense, that's what this book is. This book is a kind of campaign handbook. And I've been communicating with a number of current candidates for Congress and other offices, and have sent several of them copies of the book. And so my advice would be to read this book and urge your followers and your volunteers and your campaign staff to read this book. I had a couple of nice conversations just in the last week with Blair Walsingham, who's running for Congress in Tennessee District 1. And she's read several chapters now and is talking about it. So my hope, again, getting back to your question about Andrew in 2024, my goal is that we already have a basic income before then. And maybe he still wants to be president, but I'm hoping that we can have active debates about these ideas this winter. And if it doesn't happen this year, then maybe we'll have 100 basic income candidates in 2022 and elect a bunch of them to Congress so that it's the first bill on the floor after that new Congress takes office.
When you work with candidates, Steve, and who are supportive of UBI, what would be an example of something that you see well-intentioned people miss, or nuance that they don't emphasize sufficiently, that's common for a kind of early UBI supporter, but not someone who's got it really dialed in? What are some examples? I know, I'm sure the book has a ton of them, but could you share one or two?
Yeah, the main thing that I emphasize is to just keep it simple. and to really speak to people about their needs, concerns, and interests. As I say on the text on the cover and at the website, ourfutureubi.com, any version of a UBI, any amount, any variations, whatever we do about cutting and simplifying current programs will be a huge step forward. So if you're talking to rural voters who supported Trump in the last election, just emphasize that your life will be better off, even if it's just $500 a month. And the important thing is that the money will be in your hands and you will be making the decisions about what's best for your life instead of government bureaucrats and dealing with regulations and obstructions. So again, it's to make these ideas very clear and simple and personal. A lot of the knee-jerk objections, I'm sure you and our other Yang Gang listeners and friends have all heard, are, oh, but people will waste or squander the money. Mm-hmm. And my immediate answer is, yes, some will, but so what? You and your family will be better off. Our government will be smaller, more responsive, more effective, more efficient. And if other people waste or squander the money, that's their problem. You won't be harmed by that. And indeed, you will be much better off in just about every way. A knee-jerk response we hear from a lot of people is, oh, how do you pay for it? And Andrew, of course, talked a lot about the 10% VAT. Mm-hmm. I say there are really lots of ways to pay for it. And in fact, a lot of the money simply will come from simplifying government. And so when I talk to our liberal friends, indeed conservatives also, I often emphasize that this totally eliminates the rationale for corporate welfare. Why should government be subsidizing any corporation? Indeed, conservative ideology is that they believe in markets. So if you truly believe in markets, then government should not be interfering in the market by subsidizing employers who promise to create jobs. Give everyone the basic income, trust people to find or create jobs for ourselves. And if some people choose to be full-time parents or poets or political activists, that'll be their choice and might be best for them and their families and for our whole society.
Let me play devil's advocate with you for a second.
Oh, please. I love when people play devil's advocate.
Before I do that, I should also thank Irina Dukan, who introduced us and is in the live chat now for recommending you to the show. So here's a devil's advocate question. Some people could say, well, the thing that we call corporate welfare is sometimes necessary to support industries or corporations that are important for the national security of the country. Like we have to have a thriving aerospace industry for defense purposes. So if we do stuff to help Boeing, you know, that's good for America. Or we need to be able to provide food for our citizens and have infrastructure to deliver food, you know, to hundreds of millions of people here. And so if we have to subsidize grain and corn and cattle, you know, that's for the country's sake. And if you just give the money to the citizens, like who knows, they may end up buying stuff that isn't even produced in America. What do you say to that?
If you're concerned that people are going to buy stuff that isn't produced in America, then launch a public relations campaign to tell people to buy American. If you're concerned about food and such, then people will have the money and they'll shop at their farmers markets, or they'll use their time to plant gardens in the backyard. If you're concerned about national security, well, America's military is grossly larger than the next 7 or 8 or 9 countries combined, and most of those are our friends or allies. So we can certainly afford to make major cuts in military spending, and there's actually a chapter in the book on world peace. And I suggest that the basis of our foreign policy should be to actively promote peace, and to do that by stopping our weapons sales and by discouraging other countries from selling weapons, and most of all, by encouraging other countries to enact some version of a basic income. I even present a plan for peace in the Middle East, starting with a basic income for Israelis and Palestinians, so that people know that their basic security is met and they can then begin to relate as individuals. So I believe all of those objections can be easily handled, because basic income directly empowers individuals as consumers, as citizens, to decide what's best for ourselves, our families, and our communities.
No, that's great. I'm going to open it up to audience questions in a minute. So folks, feel free to type your questions in the live chat and I'll try and pick off a few of them. While we wait for that, I was having a conversation with one of my brothers who's very hardcore MAGA. And one of the things that he found, I think, intriguing was when we were talking about, well, you know, if other countries implemented basic income, it may actually reduce the incentive to illegally immigrate into the U.S. and reduce sort of some of this mass unexpected migration you're seeing in many parts of the world. What do you think about, like, you know, developing countries considering basic income? Or do you think this is something like you have to be a wealthy country to do it?
There are basic income experiments underway in a number of developing countries, Namibia, Kenya, India, South America. And again, I think our foreign policy, instead of building a wall on the southern border, we should be helping Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador to enact some small version of a basic income so that the people there have the security and can afford to stay where they are and can demand more responsive governments where they live. So I agree with your brother on that point. And
yeah, I know. I'm not sure I got him all the way over, but he started to think about it. I hope. I don't know. We'll see. You know, some of these MAGA folks are pretty hard.
Put me on the. Let's do another interview put him on with me, and we'll see if I can get him all the way over, or get him to read my book first, and then we'll see.
Yeah. Well, I also had another question for you about, in the U.S. now, you see some mayors talking about basic income experiments. Yeah. And on the one hand, when I see that, I'm quite heartened, and I'm like, oh, that's great. You know, we're starting to get a little traction here. On the other hand, I feel like, well, how does that work? Like, how do the economics of that work? Because when it's done at the national level, I get like, okay, you could do a VAT, or you could think about sort of income taxes. You have a lot of resources to fund a basic income. Now, if you're the mayor of a town or a city, I don't know, like, I guess property taxes would be one way to do it. But what are your thoughts on local kind of like micro UBI pilots versus a federal?
There are a lot of questions embedded in that, and we'll unpack them a little bit. If the national basic income is, say, $500 a month, which is a reasonable amount, that's the amount that's being distributed in the Stockton Economic Empowerment Demonstration. So if the national amount is $500, well, that doesn't go very far if you live in downtown DC or in Silicon Valley or in Manhattan. And so local governments may want to supplement that amount in order to keep their citizens from moving out to rural areas. And you mentioned property tax. The whole issue of, and again, this is what comes from decades of working on these ideas and from exploring all the variations. Property tax is a more interesting and important issue than people realize. Currently, in most places, the property tax is primarily on buildings. And the assessment process is very complicated, and the assessments are often disputed. And in California, everything was screwed up from Proposition 13, which doesn't allow increases in the property tax. But there's another idea that I discuss in the book, which is a land value tax. And that's to shift the property tax off of the building and onto the land. Because land value almost always, almost everywhere goes up. And when people build buildings and when cities install metros and other mass transit and improve other forms of public works and public assets, property values go up. So if you tax the value of the land, that creates strong incentives for developers to use the land most efficiently. And so you would get high-rise buildings near subway stations. And because the land value tax is based on the rental value of the land, it also acts to preserve farmland. Because if a developer wants to go in and buy the farms and put up a housing division, well, houses will bring in more people and will bring in more commerce, and so the property values will go up, whereas if it's left as farmland, the land value stays lower, and it protects farms close to cities. And there are a lot of places that have done this. There are cities in Pennsylvania that have the land value tax. There are other places around the world. So again, if we start with the basic income, we then have a point of leverage to engage citizens wherever they live in demanding the whole range of reforms, in demanding better schools and better health care, in demanding better transit and other public assets, in preserving forests and farmlands and wetlands, and beginning to reverse the environmental degradation that has become so widespread over recent decades. So it's not that basic income is a panacea, but it's a very long and sturdy lever to move the whole world in positive directions.
Great. I have a question from one of our loyal viewers, Jennifer Montgomery. Do you have a point of view on Yang's proposal of democracy dollars and any thoughts on reparations in addition to UBI?
Happy to answer both questions, Jennifer. Happy to hear from you. Yes, in chapter 10 of the book, I use the structure of the preamble to the Constitution to summarize many of the benefits of a UBI. And in the preamble, as we all might recall, that first phrase is to form a more perfect union. And when that was written, the union was far from perfect. There were all kinds of political and economic troubles. And today, of course, the union is far from perfect. Our democracy is quite fragile. And so in that section, very briefly, I summarize a whole range of political reforms, including democracy dollars, and say absolutely. And with the basic income, we have the political lever to engage ordinary citizens in demanding democracy dollars and demanding ranked choice voting and demanding that we get all money out of politics and demanding gerrymandering reform and other concerns and issues. Now, on the question of reparations, that's one I've thought about a lot. And yes, I believe in reparations, but of course, it's not solely up to me or up to anyone. And it seems clear to me, after many years of listening to conversations, and I live in Washington, D.C. I know a lot of serious Black activists. When I first moved here, I met a number of the longtime DC statehood activists who had been fighting against the Democratic Party establishment and the status quo politics for a very long time. And the core issue of reparations is almost impossible to discuss in a thoughtful, productive way at this point, because we're all so constrained by struggling to pay our bills. So I think when we have a basic income, it will be much easier to have those conversations. Now, reparations, of course, is not just reparations for slavery long ago, but for the crimes and injustices that continue today. We have a president in the White House who, as a real estate developer in the 60s and 70s, was guilty of redlining and of excluding Blacks from his property. So the racial wealth gap is very real and very serious, and we need to do something to address that. Exactly what to do and how to structure reparations, I don't know, and that's why I want to start with a basic income first, so that everyone can afford to manage their food and shelter while we have these conversations.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the benefits of a basic income and the people who would have the biggest change in their quality of life, I would imagine there would be disproportionate support and benefits to folks from traditionally disadvantaged backgrounds.
Absolutely. Right? And many people in the basic income network, Yang Gang and beyond, know that Martin Luther King was a great supporter in his last year, in his last book. And I quote him several times throughout Our Future. And in the appendix, I have a comprehensive chronological history of related ideas with, I think the entry for Dr. King is the longest, with several quotes from his last book and ideas. And King's argument for a guaranteed income absolutely resonates today. And it's not about reparations for the Blacks. Most of the recipients will be poor whites. But today, on all of these issues of reparations and racial justice, issues of class and race are so confounded and conflated that I think basic income, or guaranteed income as King called it, is really a necessary starting point.
Great. We have another viewer question. I'm not even sure I know what these are. There's a bunch of interesting terms in here. A green market trust-backed UBI crypto. Any thoughts on any of that?
I'm not sure what exactly that means. At our meetings of the U.S. Basic Income Network, and I have several friends here in D.C. who are big proponents of crypto funding for a UBI. And I have to admit that when I hear those conversations, I just sort of tune out, because I don't see any practical way to make that work. And even more fundamentally, we have government and we need government. And I think using the standard government currency will empower all of us to make our government more effective, efficient, and responsive.
Yeah, my view on the crypto stuff, whenever UBI comes up, is this is a complicated, hard sell to begin with. Do we really want to say like,
absolutely.
oh, I'm trying to get you to buy into this concept, and I also need you to accept a new way to transfer value. It's like, oh God, that might be a hard road to hoe. But appreciate your question, Farrell. Here's a question from Harkins Aquatics. Have you spoken to any Nevada lawmakers? They are very tight-lipped, but they are trying behind closed doors. Any insights there?
I don't have any contacts with Nevada lawmakers, but I will say that that's generally true. We were talking a moment ago about AOC, and another new member of Congress, Abby Finkenauer from Iowa, another young Democrat, also supports basic income. In fact, I met her at a basic income conference in San Francisco in November of 2017 when she was just launching her campaign. And there are several other members of Congress who will happily talk about it in private, but are not ready to be public about this idea of a basic income because it's a big, bold idea and it would promote tremendous transformations in politics and society. And the old saying is that politicians always have their finger in the wind, waiting to see which way the wind is blowing, or they're always ready to jump into the parade and try to get in front of the parade. But it's up to us to start the parade and get the wind blowing first. And I think as there's enough momentum, a lot of politicians will join us.
Yeah, it's such a tough lane to navigate, in that on the left, you have, some folks, at least like AOC months ago, saying, oh, this is a terrible idea. It's not really progressive. And then on the right, you have, all these like instant accusations of socialism and communism. And it's a tough one, right? Like, it doesn't have a natural party that's going to embrace it, at least as of now.
One of the things I strongly encourage in the book is that we just get away from those labels. And for many years, when I would talk about basic income, I would get oh, that's socialism, we can't do that. And we still hear versions of that, or people immediately rush to proclaim, oh, I'm a capitalist. The labels really obscure the facts on the ground. And I like to say that this is really the best of both. Socialism with free enterprise and the ability of people to make the decisions for themselves instead of large government bureaucracies. Markets with an absolute floor in place of the current tattered safety net. So it's both liberal and conservative because it truly is the best of both. And so let's stop just using name calling as a way to avoid serious conversation, and let's really talk about our immediate needs, concerns, and interests.
I would love to see that. I hope that happens someday. I spend enough time on Twitter and watching CNN and Fox that I'm like, oh my God, like we're just devolving into.
Yeah.
It reminds me of like arguments I used to have with friends about like the Patriots versus the Seahawks. Like it's totally not based on facts anymore. It's just like your team is evil.
Well, that's a really good comparison because that's exactly what it's like. And a lot of politics today is just tribal and name calling, and it's cult-like, and we just listen to a lot of these politicians who only want to attack and denounce the other side and never present any clear ideas of their own. And it's just really silly and I think self-destructive, and a sign that people are, Andrew had this great slogan, math, make America think harder. And I actually use the word think or thinking more than 60 times in the book, because that's one of the core themes, is that if we just slow down and stop the knee-jerk labeling and rejections and other responses, and just pause and think about what is best for ourselves and our families and our communities, I think we will soon reach a consensus that some version of basic income is not only best, but is imperative, and that we ought to get there as soon as possible.
Last question for you, Steve. Some people have thrown out an idea that is both intriguing and terrifying to me at the same time, which is like, well, if Trump is really behind and the COVID stuff really gets worse and the economy struggles further, he is not a very ideologically grounded person. He might throw a Hail Mary and say, well, I think, we should have unconditional basic income and, a pro-America dividend or something. And do you like what are your
I've seen
thoughts
that on Twitter?
Yeah. Do you think there's anything to that?
I mostly avoided Twitter and Facebook for the last 10 years while writing this book, and I'm just starting to become active on both. And I hope people listening to this will follow me on Twitter at @Shafarman, so I can start sending out things more directly. But the fact is, I see zero chance that Trump would ever do that. And I think Trump has zero credibility on any big ideas. And I think Mitch McConnell and the Republican Wall Street establishment would never let him say something like that, or would never respond in a serious way. And so I'm not at all concerned. And if Trump were to say that, it would be just tremendous in terms of pushing Joe Biden and the Democrats to say, oh, you're stealing our idea. We're going to redouble our efforts to win this election and make it happen. So I'm not at all concerned, and I welcome anything that talks about these. It's the old saying in marketing. If they're talking about you and your idea, you're making progress, even if they're criticizing.
Well,
so let's have it. Let's bring it on.
A follow-up question on that, Steve. Some people have argued if you really want to see basic income, neither Trump nor Biden will move the ball down the field, and that in some ways, a Trump reelection that becomes a absolute disaster from 2021 to 24 might actually set the conditions for openness to an idea like basic income at the end of his second term, and that Biden is, too established, too much in the pockets of kind of the DNC kind of insiders, and he'll never go for it. Do you have a view on whether this presidential election matters in terms of UBI support in the long run?
Yes, this presidential election matters immensely. This is hugely consequential. And you say Trump might make things immensely worse in the next 4 years. Well, things are immensely worse right now. And everything that's happening with Trump and the Republicans is just a disaster for ordinary Americans, whether we individuals are feeling it or not. It's a disaster for our planet, a disaster for international relations. And when I first moved to DC in the fall of '99, I would sometimes joke that I'm living in the capital of a dying empire. And I have a friend who actually published a book some years ago called The End of the U.S. Empire, in which he discussed the fact that the U.S. empire is clearly declining in many ways, and that the end would be very traumatic for we Americans. So with regard to Biden, yes, he comes out of the Democratic Party establishment. He was very close to Wall Street. He was from Delaware, which is headquarters for many big banks. but he's open to new ideas. And the challenge now is not only to elect him, but along with him, to elect Blair Walsingham and Alex Morse and Jen Perlman and a whole bunch of other basic income candidates, Donna Imam, other people you've had on your show. And with basic income candidates in office, we will have a lot of points of leverage to push the party forward, and especially right now because of the COVID-19 and the economic crisis. There's been so much talk about the emergency basic income and extended unemployment benefits. Well, this is a time when we need much more bold action, and whatever we do to get beyond the immediate crisis is an opportunity to then fall back into a true universal basic income funded by simplifying the tax code and eliminating the tax breaks and subsidies that go to the wealthy and that go to the corporations. And I have ideas about all of that in the book.
You seem optimistic that Biden will nudge in the right direction. I hope he will. I'm supporting him as a clear superior choice versus the Trump team. But I wonder, I am also, to be honest, a little surprised that he hasn't said more about it. What gives you that kind of optimism that that Joe will move?
Well, we have to keep nudging him in all of the ways that we can and keep the pressure on in all of the ways that we can. Part of my optimism is that I just see what kind of a person he is and that his political style is one of deep empathy, and he really does seem to care about working people and the very poor. Part of my optimism is that I think it was in September a year ago when the primaries were just really heating up. Andrew was in DC at one point, and we had a few minutes to talk, and he said that he really liked Biden, and he had a sense that Biden really was a good candidate and a good person and willing to listen. Part of my optimism is that I think it's just a lot healthier and more pleasant to be optimistic.
Well, amen to that. I am going to keep my fingers crossed. I mean, I think you're absolutely right about Biden does have a sense of true empathy, and I don't feel like he's, anti-basic income. I just feel like he hasn't, come around to, like, I think he's still warming up to it. And hopefully,
that's why I've got to get him. Got to get him to read my book and get him to understand the issue more fully. And I think he will come around to it. And I've listened to the 3 big policy speeches that he gave on climate and on economic issues and on infrastructure, and all of the goals that he articulates we can achieve much more quickly and easily and at lower cost if we start with a basic income. And I believe that we can get him to see that and get him to see that basic income truly is a way to fulfill the promises that he is making and to transform this country in the most positive directions.
I love it. Well, Steve, I appreciate you coming on the show. And a lot of folks may not know this. I picked the Maine coastal background because we both went to undergrad at rival schools in the great state of Maine. And, if a Bowdoin and Colby person can have a calm, reasonable conversation, maybe anything is possible.
Anything is possible. Everything is possible. And our job is to make it come true. So
Right.
Let's make history.
I love it. Let's do it. And hopefully we'll get you back on the show in the future, Steve.
I'd love to come back on and talk to your audience about more specific details and about more specific campaigns. As I mentioned, I'm very eager to be working with more candidates for Congress and other offices, and wrote the book to be a handbook for their campaigns. And I'd be happy to come on and see if I can move your brother the rest of the way toward common sense and good judgment and off of his knee-jerk support for MAGA.
Well, that even as an optimist, I might put that one lower on my list, but we'll give it our best shot. And but everybody, you heard it here. If you are supporting a Yang Gang for Congress, or you are a candidate and you're looking for help to kind of like strengthen your UBI platform or help hone your narrative, sounds like Steve is open and willing to provide some advice, some feedback. So definitely take him up on it and check out his book, Our Future. It is available on Amazon and all the major probably booksellers, and it's your third basic income book. So this one,
actually, it's my sixth.
Oh my God! Yeah. So
as I say, I've really been obsessive about these ideas, and at the website ourfutureubi.com, I briefly tell the story about how I've been constantly searching for ways to communicate this more clearly and effectively, and I believe this book does that as powerfully as possible and as powerfully as needed. And I hope it's my last book on UBI, because I want to see it implemented within the next 2 or 3 years.
Maybe the next one will be talking about the early benefits and impact of the first phase of implementation in the U.S.
Somebody else can write that one. I'll be happy to sit down and be interviewed for whoever wants to write about that. I've got other things I'd like to be doing with my life.
I love it. I love it. Yeah, 6 might be enough. Well, thank you again, Steve. With that, I think we'll say bye, nerds.
Bye, nerds. This has been fun.
Keep it real.